The news spread through Winterfell like a winter chill, biting deep and settling in the bones. Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, the man known for his unwavering sense of honor, had legitimized his bastard son, Jon Snow, and declared him Lord of Winterfell. A collective gasp seemed to echo through the stone halls, a sound compounded of disbelief, outrage, and a simmering resentment that threatened to boil over. We need to understand just how seismic this decision was. In Westeros, bastards are, for the most part, invisible. They carry the stain of illegitimacy, forever barred from inheriting titles or lands. They are a constant reminder of a parent's transgression, a living embodiment of shame. To elevate a bastard above true-born heirs was not just a breach of tradition, it was an insult to the very foundations of noble society. And nowhere was that insult felt more keenly than within the Stark family itself. Let's start with Catelyn Stark. From the moment Jon Snow had arrived at Winterfell, carried in Ent's arms as a babe, Catelyn had seen him as a constant reminder of her husband's infidelity. She had never truly accepted him, her heart hardening against the child born of another woman. She had tolerated him, yes, out of respect for End, but never loved him. And now this was beyond bearing. "He did what?" Catelyn hissed at End, her voice barely a whisper, but laced with a venom that could curdle milk. They were in their private solar, the fire crackling uselessly against the icy fury in her eyes. "He is my son, Catelyn," End replied, his voice low and weary. "He has Stark blood." "And what of Robb's blood, of Sansa, of Arya, of Bran? End, have you forgotten your true-born children?" Catelyn rounded on him, her hands clenched into fists. "You have shamed me, End. You shamed me years ago with your silence, and now you shame my children. You hand our son's birthright to a bastard." "He is no bastard now," End countered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "That doesn't make him family, End," Catelyn retorted, her voice rising in pitch. "It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't change the fact that he is a living, breathing reminder of your betrayal." End said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. He knew the pain he had caused Catelyn, the wound that festered beneath the surface, never truly healed. But he believed he was doing what was right, what was necessary. But what of Robb? Robb Stark, the heir to Winterfell, the young wolf, now suddenly displaced by a half-brother he had always considered a close friend. To Robb, Jon was more than just a bastard. He was a sparring partner, a confidant, a brother in all but name. They had trained together, hunted together, shared dreams of adventure and glory. Robb had always assumed that one day he would rule Winterfell with Jon at his side, loyal and true. But now Jon had everything. The name, the title, the future that Robb had always taken for granted. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of the loss of inheritance, but because it came from his father, a man Robb idolized. It felt like a rejection, a tacit admission that Robb was somehow lacking. The Great Hall of Winterfell felt different that evening. The usual warmth and camaraderie were replaced by a palpable tension. The Stark banners seemed to hang heavier, the flickering torchlight casting long, dancing shadows that mirrored the unease in the room. Jon entered, dressed in the Stark colors, the gray and white replacing the drab blacks he had always worn. He walked with a newfound confidence, but beneath the surface, his unease was plain to see. He knew that his presence was causing a rift, a division in the family he had always longed to be a part of. Robb stood beside his mother, his face a mask of controlled anger. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. "So it's true then?" Robb said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Jon nodded slowly, his throat tight. "I didn't ask for this, Robb." "No," Robb replied, his gaze unwavering. "But you accepted it, didn't you?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the nervous whispers of the Stark household. The weight of expectation, of resentment, hung heavy in the air. Sansa, ever the dutiful daughter, watched from the sidelines, her brow furrowed with concern. She loved Jon, but she also understood the implications of this decision for her brother, for the family. The situation was complicated, messy, and Sansa, with her inherent desire for harmony and order, struggled to comprehend it. Arya, on the other hand, simply didn't understand the fuss. She had always seen Jon as a true Stark, regardless of his birth. She rushed to his side, throwing her arms around him in a fierce hug, oblivious to the tension in the room. Her simple act of affection only served to deepen the cut for Robb. Even young Bran and Rickon, too young to fully grasp the political implications, sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the undercurrent of unease that permeated the very walls of Winterfell. Dinner that night was a strained affair. Jon sat beside End at the high table, in the seat that Robb had always occupied. The food tasted bland, the wine sour. Every clink of silverware, every rustle of clothing seemed amplified, a constant reminder of the disruption that had been unleashed. Later that night, Robb was found in the training yard, his fury unleashed on a practice dummy. He swung his sword with savage intensity, each blow a manifestation of his anger and frustration. He had always been the heir, the future of House Stark. Now that future seemed uncertain, clouded by doubt and resentment. End had hoped to unite his family to secure Jon's place in the world. But his actions had instead created a chasm, a divide that threatened to tear the Starks apart. He had intended to heal a wound, but in doing so, he had only inflicted new ones, deeper and more painful than before. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing Winterfell in a silent, unforgiving embrace. A storm was brewing, not just in the skis above, but within the very heart of House Stark. The weight of the North settled on Jon like the first snowfall of winter, beautiful, but heavy and unrelenting. End's pronouncement in the Godswood, the sudden elevation to Lord of Winterfell, had fractured the Stark household in ways he couldn't have imagined. He walked the halls now, not as Jon Snow, the tolerated bastard, but as Jon Stark, the Lord, and the change was palpable and overwhelmingly negative. The servants, once familiar and sometimes even friendly, now regarded him with a mixture of deference and suspicion. Their smiles were strained, their bows deeper, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a cautious politeness that felt colder than the Winterfell winds. Maester Luwin, ever the pragmatist, addressed him as "my lord" with unfailing regularity, but Jon could see the question in his eyes, the unspoken doubt about whether he was truly fit to lead. It was Catelyn Stark's animosity, however, that cut the deepest. She barely acknowledged his existence, her gaze sliding past him as if he were a ghost haunting her home. When their paths did cross, her words were clipped and laced with venom, each syllable a reminder of his perceived transgression. It was as though he were personally responsible for Ent's actions, for the upheaval he had caused. Meals were a strained affair. Jon sat at the head of the table, a place formerly occupied by Robb, and the silence was thick enough to choke on. Catelyn would pointedly ignore him, engaging in conversation with Robb, Sansa, and even Arya, as if Jon were simply a piece of unwelcome furniture. Robb, his brother in all but blood, was a study in barely suppressed resentment. The easy camaraderie they had shared, the shared jokes and training sessions in the yard, were now replaced by a stiff formality. They spoke when necessary, discussing matters of governance and defense, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a coolness that chilled Jon to the bone. He tried to reach out, to explain that he hadn't asked for this, but his words seemed to bounce off Robb's armor of hurt and anger. Each interaction only seemed to widen the chasm between them. Even Sansa, who had always been polite, regarded him with a newfound wariness. Her dreams of courtly life, of handsome princes and grand balls, seemed to have hardened into a pragmatism that viewed Jon as an obstacle to her ambitions. She still offered him polite smiles, but they lacked the genuine warmth of her younger years, replaced by a calculating observation that made him uneasy. Arya, bless her defiant heart, remained his staunch ally. She still sought him out, teasing him in the training yard and slipping him honey cakes from the kitchens. But even her loyalty couldn't fully penetrate the cloud of resentment that had settled over Winterfell. She tried her best to comfort him. The Northern Lords, too, presented a challenge. Many had known Robb since he was a babe in arms. They had seen him grow into a skilled warrior and a natural leader. To them, Jon was an unknown quantity, a sudden upstart who had been thrust into a position of authority without earning it. They paid him lip service, attended his council meetings, and listened to his pronouncements, but Jon could feel their skepticism, their unspoken questions about his competence. He knew he had to prove himself, to demonstrate that he was worthy of the trust End had placed in him, but every step he took seemed to be met with resistance, with subtle challenges to his authority. He needed the loyalty of the North, and that could only be gained by respect. And looming over all of this, like a storm gathering on the horizon, was the impending arrival of King Robert Baratheon. The king's visit, intended to solidify Jon's position as lord, threatened to exacerbate the already simmering tensions within Winterfell. Robert's presence meant courtiers, feasts, and scrutiny, and Jon knew that his every move would be dissected and judged. How would he present himself to the king? How would he navigate the treacherous currents of courtly politics? How could he possibly hope to impress a man who was already surrounded by flatterers and schemers? The preparations for the king's arrival were a whirlwind of activity. Servants scurried about, polishing silver, arranging tapestries, and preparing lavish feasts. The armory was abuzz with activity as guards polished their armor and sharpened their swords. Even Robb seemed to find a renewed sense of purpose in the preparations, meticulously overseeing every detail of the king's security and comfort. Catelyn, however, remained aloof, delegating tasks with a curt efficiency that made it clear she wanted as little to do with Jon as possible. He wanted to impress King Robert because not only was he the king, but Jon admired him. He was Ned Stark's best friend and the one person who could turn Jon's world on its head. Jon found himself increasingly drawn to the godswood, seeking solace beneath the ancient heart tree. He would sit for hours, listening to the rustling of the leaves and the gentle murmur of the wind, trying to find clarity in the midst of the chaos. He closed his eyes and focused on the calmness of the godswood. Was he truly worthy of this responsibility? Could he ever truly escape the shadow of his past? Was he destined to forever be an outsider, a stranger in his own home? He remembered the day when he asked his uncle Benjen if he could join the Night's Watch. He had always wanted to fit in somewhere. The impending arrival of King Robert Baratheon was a double-edged sword. It offered Jon an opportunity to prove himself, to earn the respect of the Northern Lords, and to solidify his position as Lord of Winterfell. But it also threatened to expose the deep divisions within the Stark household, to exacerbate the resentment and mistrust that had already taken root. Jon was caught in the middle, torn between his desire to serve his family, to honor his father's wishes, and his own deep-seated insecurities. The snow continued to fall outside the windows of Winterfell, blanketing the landscape in a layer of pristine white. But beneath that serene surface, a storm was brewing, a storm that threatened to tear the Stark household apart. King Robert's arrival. Robert Baratheon arrives at Winterfell, solidifying Jon's position as lord but also revealing his hidden agenda, to recruit Ned as Hand of the King, which will take him to King's Landing. The horn blasted from the gates of Winterfell, a sound that resonated through the ancient stones and sent flocks of birds scattering into the pale northern sky. This wasn't just any arrival. This was the King of the Seven Kingdoms, Robert Baratheon, come to visit the North. And for Jon Snow, the newly declared Lord of Winterfell, it was a moment fraught with both promise and peril. Days before, the scouts had reported the royal procession snaking its way through the neck, a shimmering line of gold and crimson against the somber landscape. Now, the vanguard was at the gates, and the full weight of the crown was about to descend upon Winterfell. The courtyard, usually a scene of ordered training and quiet industry, was now a chaotic tapestry of Stark banners and royal standards. Servants scurried, polishing armor, arranging feasts, and attempting to impose some semblance of order on the throng of knights, lords, and camp followers that had accompanied the king. Robb, ever the pragmatist, oversaw the logistical nightmare, his brow furrowed with concern. Catelyn, however, remained aloof, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her expression unreadable. For her, Robert's arrival was a further intrusion, another complication in a household already reeling from Ned's decision to legitimize Jon. And Jon, he stood beside Ned on the steps of the Great Keep, trying to project an air of calm authority, a posture that felt alien and uncomfortable. The weight of Winterfell rested squarely on his shoulders, a burden made heavier by the knowledge that every eye, both northern and southern, would be scrutinizing his every move. The gates swung open, and the royal procession began to pour into the courtyard. Banners emblazoned with the crowned stag of House Baratheon rippled in the wind, a stark contrast to the gray direwolf that stood proudly above the gates. Knights in gleaming armor, their faces hidden behind visors, rode alongside richly dressed lords and ladies, their voices a jarring cacophony against the somber northern backdrop. At the head of the procession rode Robert Baratheon himself. He was a mountain of a man, his once handsome face now bloated and scarred, his black hair streaked with gray. But his booming laugh and powerful presence still commanded attention. Beside him rode a much younger man, fair-haired and impeccably dressed, Prince Joffrey, heir to the Iron Throne. As Robert dismounted, his gaze swept over the assembled Starks, lingering for a moment on Catelyn before settling on End. A grin spread across his face, and he lumbered forward, pulling End into a bear hug that threatened to crush the breath from his lungs. "End, by the gods, it's good to see you, old friend," Robert bellowed, his voice echoing through the courtyard. "You've kept the North too damn cold for too long." End returned the embrace, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Robert, it's been too long." As Robert released End, his gaze shifted, falling upon Jon. There was a moment of tense silence, a palpable weighing of one man by another. Jon stood tall, meeting the king's gaze directly, refusing to flinch or cower. Robert's eyes, though clouded with drink and years of indulgence, seemed to pierce through Jon's facade, searching for something hidden beneath the surface. Finally, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "This him End," Robert boomed, gesturing towards Jon with a thick hand. "The bastard boy." The word hung in the air, a sharp reminder of Jon's past. A hush fell over the courtyard as everyone waited for End's response. End's voice was firm, unwavering. "This is my son, Jon Stark, Lord of Winterfell." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Robert raised a thick eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "Lord of Winterfell, you say?" He paused, a beat too long for comfort. "You gave the boy your name, End." End met Robert's gaze without flinching. "He is a Stark, he always was." Robert stared at Jon for another long, uncomfortable moment. Jon's heart pounded in his chest, a drumbeat against the silence. Was Robert judging him, approving, disapproving? He couldn't tell. Then Robert threw back his head and laughed, a loud, booming sound that startled the horses and sent echoes bouncing off the castle walls. "Well then," Robert boomed, clapping Jon on the shoulder with a force that nearly staggered him. "The North truly is a strange place, but welcome, Lord Stark. May your reign be long and prosperous, though I imagine that's mostly thanks to End here, eh?" The tension in the courtyard eased slightly, but Jon knew that Robert's words were laced with a subtle undercurrent of scrutiny, a hint of something more to come. The feast that night was a lavish affair, a collision of northern austerity and southern excess. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, spiced wines, and exotic fruits. Banners of Stark and Baratheon hung side by side, but the atmosphere remained strained, a forced display of unity that barely concealed the underlying tensions. Jon sat beside End at the high table, acutely aware of every glance, every whisper, every gesture. He was the center of attention, a curiosity, a symbol of End's defiance of tradition. Robb sat further down the table, his face set in a grim mask, his eyes fixed on his plate. Catelyn, as she had requested, dined in her chambers under the guise of illness, her absence a silent condemnation. Throughout the feast, Robert regaled the court with tales of his past glories, his booming laughter filling the hall. But Jon noticed that his eyes kept returning to End, a silent plea in their depths. As the night wore on, Robert finally stood, raising his goblet high. "To Eddard Stark," he announced, his voice booming across the hall. "My brother in arms and my future hand of the king." The hall erupted in applause. End gave Jon a subtle glance, a look of quiet resignation. Jon's heart sank. He knew this was coming, of course, but hearing it aloud, knowing that End would soon be leaving Winterfell, leaving him to navigate the treacherous waters of lordship alone, filled him with a sense of dread. After the feast, as the revelry continued in the great hall, End and Robert walked alone in the courtyard, their breath frosting in the cold night air. "I'm not a politician, Robert," End said, his voice weary. "You know that." Robert laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think I am? Gods, no, but I need you, End. Jon Arryn is dead and the Vipers are circling. I need someone I can trust." Come south with you and leave Winterfell? End asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the distant stars. Leave my sons. Robert turned, his eyes narrowing. That bastard boy, he's got the look. End's blood turned cold. What look? Robert scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. You know what I mean, the look of. His mother, was she noble, End, or some tavern wench? End didn't answer, his silence speaking volumes. Robert stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You raised him, named him, made him lord. Why, End? Why this bastard over your true-born son? Because I owe him more than anyone will ever understand, Robert, End said, his voice firm, resolute. He is my son. Robert didn't push further, but the look in his eyes was wary, perhaps even fearful. He knew something wasn't right, that End was keeping secrets. He just didn't know how those secrets would soon change everything. The arrival of Robert had validated Jon's new position, but it had also set in motion events that would tear the Stark family apart, sending End south into the Viper's nest of King's Landing and leaving Jon to face the harsh realities of leadership alone. The Game of Thrones had come to Winterfell, and Jon was now a player, whether he wanted to be or not. The ink was barely dry on the legitimization papers, the celebrations still echoing through the halls, and the chill of winter deepened not just outside the castle walls, but within them. End's decision to name Jon the Lord of Winterfell had fractured the family in ways that perhaps even he hadn't fully anticipated. Now, as he prepared to depart for King's Landing, the repercussions of that choice were about to be amplified. His leaving wasn't just about answering Robert's call or fulfilling his duty. It was about tearing apart the fragile peace he'd attempted to forge. He was taking Sansa and Arya south, leaving Robb to grapple with the reality of a bastard brother now holding the title he'd always expected to inherit. And Jon, well, Jon was left to navigate a treacherous landscape of northern politics, simmering resentment, and Catelyn's barely concealed animosity. End knew this departure was going to be difficult on both of them. He felt the weight of responsibility for their growing resentment. As much as he wanted to avoid having to put either son through a test of character like this, he felt it was necessary. The decision has been made. The crown would expect a Lord of Winterfell to command loyalty and respect amongst his people and to Robert Baratheon. He must go south to serve, and Robb must stay north to learn. The day of departure dawned gray and bleak. The courtyard was a hive of activity as servants loaded wagons with supplies and the royal guard readied their horses. Sansa, eager for the courtly life, fluttered about in her finest silks, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. Arya, though excited for adventure, couldn't quite mask her apprehension. She knew King's Landing was a viper's nest, and she was leaving behind the familiar comfort of Winterfell for the unknown. End embraced each of his children, offering words of encouragement and caution. To Sansa, he stressed the importance of remaining true to herself amidst the intrigues of the court. To Arya, he urged her to be observant and discreet, reminding her that silence could be her greatest weapon. But when it came to Jon and Robb, the words caught in his throat. He found them both standing together near the stables, a palpable tension hanging in the air. Robb's jaw was clenched, his gaze fixed on the departing caravan. Jon stood slightly behind him, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his expression unreadable. Robb, End began, placing a hand on his shoulder. You will rule Winterfell in my absence. I trust you to make wise decisions and to protect our people. Robb nodded curtly, avoiding his father's gaze. I will do my duty, he said, his voice flat. End sighed inwardly. He knew Robb felt betrayed, that he saw this as an attempt to usurp his birthright. Jon will assist you, he continued. He knows the North, and he has a good head on his shoulders. Robb finally turned to face his father, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. So, he's my advisor now, the bastard I have to answer to. End's brow furrowed. Robb, that's enough. Jon is your brother. He deserves your respect. Respect is earned, father, Robb retorted, not granted by decree. End opened his mouth to argue, but Jon stepped forward, his voice calm and measured. Robb is right, father. I understand his feelings. I will not overstep my bounds. I will offer advice when asked, but I will not interfere with his rule. End looked from one son to the other, a deep sadness washing over him. He had hoped to bridge the divide, to foster understanding and cooperation, but his efforts seemed to have backfired. The rift between them was wider than ever, and his departure was only going to make things worse. He placed a hand on Jon's shoulder, squeezing it gently. "Look after Robb," he said quietly. "He needs you even if he doesn't realize it." Then with a heavy heart, he turned and mounted his horse. As he rode out of Winterfell, he glanced back one last time. Robb stood stiffly beside Jon, their faces etched with a mixture of resentment and uncertainty. Catelyn stood further up on the battlements, staring towards End with a sense of loathing in her gaze. He knew he was leaving them at a crossroads. Whether they chose to unite or to tear each other apart was now in their hands. And as he rode south into the maelstrom of King's Landing, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was abandoning his home to a gathering storm. Back in the courtyard, a tense silence hung in the air long after End's party had disappeared from view. Robb finally broke it with a sigh. "Well, Jon," he said, turning to face his brother, "looks like we're in charge now." Jon met his gaze, his expression unwavering. "Aye, Robb, we are." Catelyn's presence loomed large over their awkward first joint meeting to discuss duties. All present knew the great divide between Catelyn and Jon, yet they could never expect anything less than that Catelyn would treat Jon with all the respect and decorum of a lord of Winterfell. Yet, after the meeting broke, Catelyn was quick to dismiss Jon from her company, and instead insisted that Robb stay a bit longer. "I fear that your father's decision has been rash," Catelyn confided in Robb. "Father always does what is right. Hasn't he taught you that?" Robb retorted to his mother with annoyance. "Your father has always done what he thinks is right. There is a clear difference. However, I fear that Jon's recent claim may place a stain on your authority as the true-born son of Lord Eddard Stark. I do not need to tell you how many bannermen in the north already look down on us Southrons. This has only emboldened them and will further erode your political power here." As Robb was ready to give in to his mother's claims once more, he took a deep breath, reminded himself of his father's honorable nature, and instead responded to Catelyn with, "I am the future of the Stark house. I do not need anyone to embolden me. Jon is a lord in name, but I will lead this land for as long as I draw breath. So do not worry about my power. Worry about the fact that we are still one man short, and that man is currently sitting in chains." Catelyn's face turned into a sneer, and she scoffed, "He is not a Stark in my eyes. You may call yourself a brother, but you will never see blood from me." Robb gave a swift nod to Catelyn and excused himself from her presence. He could not stand to be within the same room as Catelyn when she spat such venom at Jon. It was undeserved and frankly beneath someone of her supposed political standing. The North always remembered, and Catelyn's memory was never at the height of its strength. Voiceover. With Robb away, the weight of Winterfell landed squarely on Jon's shoulders. It wasn't just the day-to-day running of the castle, the ledgers, and the granaries. It was something far more subtle, far more insidious. It was the feeling of being watched, of being judged. The northern lords, hardy and suspicious, were not easily won over. They had known Robb since he was a babe in arms, seen him grow into a skilled warrior and a natural leader. Jon, on the other hand, was different. Elevated, yes, but still different. He wasn't Robb, and that in the eyes of many was his greatest failing. Scene council chamber. Jon addressing the bannermen. Lord Umber, Lord Glover, Lady Mormont, and others. "My lords and lady, the reports from the Stony Shore are troubling. The Ironborn raids are growing bolder, more frequent. We must reinforce our defenses." Lord Umber, a gruff, imposing figure, speaks. "With all due respect, Lord Snow." Jon subtly corrects him. "Stark, Lord Umber." Umber continues, unfazed. "Stark, with all due respect, our men are already stretched thin. Robb took a good portion of our fighting strength south." Lady Mormont, a woman small in stature but fierce in demeanor, adds, "And those that remain are needed to protect their own lands, Lord Stark. We cannot simply abandon our people to the Ironborn's whims." Jon nods, trying to maintain composure. "I understand, Lady Mormont, but we must think strategically. Concentrating our forces at key locations will give us the best chance of repelling their attacks." Lord Glover, a more cautious and pragmatic man, speaks. Perhaps a more measured approach is warranted, Lord Stark. We could send out scouts, assess the Ironborn's strength. Jon clenches his jaw. He knows what they're really saying. Let's wait and see. Let's see if this bastard lord is even capable of leading. We don't have time for scouting parties, Lord Glover. Every day we delay, the Ironborn grow bolder. We need to act now. Silence hangs heavy in the chamber. Jon can feel their skepticism, their resistance. He's lord in name only. In their eyes, he's still just the snow, playing a part he wasn't born to play. Voiceover. The meetings were always the same. A polite veneer of respect barely concealing the underlying doubt. He proposed plans, they offered cautious alternatives. He made decisions, they questioned his judgment. It was a constant battle, a war of attrition fought with words and glances. Scene, Winterfell courtyard. Jon overseeing training of soldiers. Sir Rodrik Castle approaches. You push them hard, Lord Stark. Jon wipes sweat from his brow. They need to be ready, Sir Rodrik. The Ironborn won't wait. Sir Rodrik nods, but his eyes hold a hint of concern. They respect your determination, my lord, but some whisper that you're too eager to prove yourself, too willing to risk lives to make a point. Jon sighs. Even Sir Rodrik, a man he trusts, doubts him. I'm not trying to prove anything, Sir Rodrik. I'm trying to protect the North. Sir Rodrik places a hand on Jon's shoulder. I know, my lord, just be mindful of the men. They follow the Starks because they trust them. Don't give them reason to question that trust. Voiceover. The pressure was immense. Every decision he made, every order he gave was scrutinized, analyzed, and often undermined. He found himself spending long hours poring over maps, studying troop movements, trying to anticipate the Ironborn's next move. Sleep became a luxury. Scene, Jon in his chambers late at night studying maps. He rubs his tired eyes. Ghost lies at his feet, a silent, comforting presence. Voiceover. Even the small folk seemed hesitant, uncertain. They bowed and scraped before him, calling him my lord, but their eyes lacked the warmth and familiarity they had shown Robb. He was an outsider, ruling a land that wasn't truly his. Scene, Jon walking through the Winterfell kitchens. A kitchen maid accidentally spills a pot of stew at Jon's feet. Oh gods, my lord, I am so sorry. Jon helps her up, ignoring the stain on his boots. It's all right, no harm done. The maid avoids his gaze, her face flushed with embarrassment. Thank you, my lord. She scurries away, leaving Jon feeling even more isolated. Voiceover. He tried to be just, to be fair, to be the kind of lord the North needed, but it was never enough. He was always reminded in subtle ways that he was not a true Stark, that he was an impostor wearing a borrowed crown. The whispers followed him everywhere, like shadows in the snow. He needed a victory, something decisive to prove himself to the northern houses, but victory eluded him. He was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Ironborn and one against the prejudice that simmered within Winterfell's walls. Okay, so Theon Greyjoy. Remember him? Robb's ward and Stark's pseudo-son. Well, loyalty, much like the iron price, apparently has to be taken, not given. While Robb, down south playing war hero, and Jon's trying to figure out how to manage a keep full of people who actively resent him, Theon decides it's time for a little family reunion. Not the warm, fuzzy kind. Think more hostile takeover. See, while Robb's busy carving a path through the Lannister armies, the Ironborn, Theon's actual family, see an opportunity. They know the North is weakened, its best fighters are gone, and Winterfell is basically being run by a well-meaning bastard and a kid in a wheelchair. Talk about low-hanging fruit. So under cover of darkness, Theon and a band of Ironborn infiltrate Winterfell. They're sneaky, they're brutal, and they're surprisingly effective. The Stark garrison, depleted and unprepared, is quickly overwhelmed. Sir Rodrik Castle, always the loyal protector, puts up a fight, but even he can't stand against the sudden, vicious assault. Theon, fueled by a toxic mix of resentment, ambition, and daddy issues, personally leads the charge. He wants to prove himself, to show his father, Balon Greyjoy, that he's a true Ironborn, not some Stark lapdog. And what better way than to seize the very seat of Stark power? The attack is swift and merciless. Ironborn axes bite deep, and the sounds of screams and clashing steel echo through the halls of Winterfell. Many are killed, many more are subdued and imprisoned. Now where's Jon in all this chaos? Well, he's ripped from sleep, jolted awake by the sounds of battle. He's caught completely off guard, disoriented, and frankly underdressed. He grabs Longclaw, his Valyrian steel sword, and charges into the fray, ready to defend his home, his people, and the name he's been given. But it's too late. The Ironborn have already seized control of the key strategic points. Theon, fueled by adrenaline and a burning desire to prove himself, confronts Jon at the top of the stairs. "Theon," Jon says, his voice tight with disbelief and betrayal, you were our brother." Theon, however, is having none of it. "I was never yours," he retorts, his voice cold and hard. The brotherly facade is gone, replaced by the steely resolve of an Ironborn raider. Winterfell is ours now. Jon knows he's outmatched, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered, but he's not going to surrender without a fight. The two clash, steel meeting steel in a desperate struggle. Jon, despite being caught off guard, fights fiercely, driven by a primal instinct to protect. But Theon, surrounded by his Ironborn, has the upper hand. Theon eventually overpowers Jon. Jon, disarmed and defeated, is dragged away, imprisoned, awaiting his fate. Theon, standing triumphant amidst the chaos, declares himself the Prince of Winterfell. But as they say, the North remembers. While Theon's busy lording it over Winterfell, thinking he's won the game, other forces are at play, and other threats loom. See, the Ironborn don't just stop at Winterfell. Their longships have been raiding the western coast of the North, pillaging villages, seizing resources, and generally making life miserable for the already beleaguered northern folk. And there are those in the North who haven't forgotten their oaths to House Stark. They may be scattered, demoralized, and outgunned, but they are not willing to let the Ironborn defile their lands unopposed. Small pockets of resistance begin to form, whispers of rebellion spread like wildfire, and a burning desire for vengeance takes root in the hearts of the northern people. Now what about Jon? Well, Theon, in a move that's equal parts strategic and utterly misguided, decides to imprison Jon not in the dungeons, but in the Stark family crypts. Talk about tempting fate. It's a symbolic gesture meant to humiliate Jon, to remind him of his bastard status, to bury him alive amongst the bones of trueborn Starks. But Theon underestimates Jon's resilience, his connection to the North, and the unwavering loyalty of at least one very large, very furry direwolf. As Jon sits, stewing in the darkness, contemplating his next move, a choice arises: surrender to the New Order or fight tooth and nail to take back what's been stolen. The choice has been made. Days passed like years in the crypts of Winterfell. Jon sat in the dark among dead kings and fallen lords, his breath misting in the air, his wrists bruised from the shackles. He ate what Theon allowed, scraps, spoke to no one, heard only rats, distant screams, and the creak of snow shifting above. He had never felt so far from life, from honor, from the name he'd been given. But every night Ghost came, slipping through cracks no man could follow. The wolf didn't make a sound. He only watched and waited. And Jon waited too, waited for the sound of chance, of opportunity, of something Theon would miss. It came on the 6th night. One of the guards, a boy no older than 16, came with food, half a heel of bread and cold broth. His hands trembled when he slid the tray through the bars. Jon leaned forward. "What's your name?" The boy flinched. "Doesn't matter." "You're from Barrowton. I can hear it in your voice. You had kin in the square, didn't you? Before Theon's men burned it." The boy looked up sharply, color draining from his face. "I'm not your enemy," Jon said softly. "You know who I am. You know I don't belong in here." The boy didn't answer, but that night, the chains came off. Ghost disappeared into the shadows, and Jon slipped out through the passage hidden behind Lyanna Stark's statue. A secret Maester Luwin once showed him long ago, when he was just a Snow who liked dark places. Winterfell had changed. The halls were patrolled by reeking Ironborn. The great hall stank of smoke and piss. The Stark banners had been torn from the rafters and replaced by the salt and Kraken, but not everyone had bent the knee. Some servants still whispered his name in fear and hope. Old Nan had hidden Bran and Hodor, carrying him through secret tunnels between the walls. Gage, the cook, passed messages and meat pies. Even Maester Luwin, though watched, had managed to keep a few scrolls from Theon's hands, messages Jon now read by moonlight. And across the north, the people were stirring because word had spread. Theon Greyjoy had taken Winterfell, but not the Stark name, and that meant there was still a lord. Jon moved through the castle like smoke, never seen, always felt. At night, he stalked ironborn sentries, marking routes, weaknesses. With Ghost at his side and stolen steel in hand, he killed too quietly, no noise, no mess, just vanished bodies in the well. Then one cold dawn, a rider arrived, a girl on a shaggy horse who reeked of the sea. Yara Greyjoy. She entered the keep like she owned it, tossing her cloak at the guards. Theon met her in the great hall with a tight grin and nervous shoulders. "Sister," he greeted. "Fool," she replied. They argued over food and strategy. Yara wanted him to abandon the castle, retreat to the sea. "This place hates you," she told him. "The people want you dead. And the wolves, well, they're not as gone as you think." But Theon refused. "I am the Prince of Winterfell." Yara laughed. "No, you're a boy playing lord in a house full of ghosts." That night Jon struck, with Ghost leading the charge and 3 loyal servants aiding in silence. They overwhelmed the east tower, then the armory, then the inner yard. The castle awoke to blood. Theon was dragged from his bed, half-dressed and screaming. Jon stood waiting by the hearth. "I should kill you now," Jon said, sword drawn. Theon knelt, coughing, "Then do it." But Jon didn't. He looked at Theon, truly looked at him, the boy who once laughed with them, who dreamed of being more, and he saw nothing but ash and ruin. "You're not worth the steel." Instead, he locked Theon in the same crypt he'd been thrown in. And this time, the dead whispered to someone else. By sunrise, the Stark banners flew again. The people of Winterfell gathered in the yard, stunned and weeping. Maester Luwin limped forward and placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Lord Stark," he said, voice thick with emotion. Jon looked at the faces before him, young, old, broken, hopeful, and he said only this. "I'm not the lord you wanted." He paused. "But I'm the one who remembers." Snow fell like ash over Winterfell. Jon stood atop the battlements, cloaked in fur, Ghost beside him. Below, the courtyard was alive again, fires in the braziers, wolves packing, men training, children laughing cautiously as if afraid joy might betray them. It looked like peace, but Jon knew better. War still raged in the south. Robb was winning battles but losing the game, and Jon was left to hold what remained of the north together. Word had spread far and fast. Jon Stark, the bastard lord, had reclaimed Winterfell. Some praised him. Others called it treason that he'd taken it back not for honor but for pride. Some lords remained quiet, waiting to see how long a name could hold a kingdom before it cracked under blood and fire. Jon couldn't blame them. Every time he looked in the mirror, he still saw snow. A raven arrived on the 5th morning after Theon's defeat. It came from Riverrun, from Catelyn. Its words were formal, cold. "You have held Winterfell in our absence. For that, the North is grateful. Robb requests you prepare for his return. He rides soon with banners, men, and crown." Jon read it twice, then again. She hadn't even signed her name. Not Catelyn, not your lady, not even Stark. Just ink, duty, distance. The Stark banners, once defiant against the winter sky, now lay trampled in the mud. A chilling testament to Theon Greyjoy's treachery. But beneath the surface of Winterfell's occupied halls, a different kind of storm was brewing. Not one of fire and steel, but of quiet defiance. A whispered name in the shadows. A flickering hope in the eyes of those who refused to break. Jon Snow, or rather Jon Stark, was about to remind the Ironborn that winter wasn't just coming, it was already here. Imprisoned in the crypts, surrounded by the silent stone faces of his ancestors, any other man might have succumbed to despair. But Jon wasn't just any man, he was a Stark. And the Starks, even in their darkest hours, remembered. They remembered honor, duty, and the unwavering spirit of the North. He used the darkness to his advantage. He waited and listened and watched. His escape was aided by 2 essential parties. First, Ghost. The loyal direwolf slipped through the cracks of the crypt with a predatory intelligence, bringing Jon food and companionship, bolstering his spirits. Second, loyal servants of Winterfell. Through hushed conversations and carefully exchanged glances, He learned the layout of the Ironborn patrols, their weaknesses, their arrogance. He discovered hidden passages, secret caches of weapons, and the unwavering support of those who still believed in the Stark name. One night, under the cover of a blizzard that howled like a banshee, Jon struck. Moving with a speed and ferocity that belied his captivity, he and Ghost infiltrated the armory, silently dispatching the guards. Dressed in stolen Ironborn armor, he navigated the corridors of Winterfell, a ghost among invaders. He moved like a shadow, his blade a whisper in the wind, liberating loyalists. Theon, drunk on victory and blind to the gathering storm, remained oblivious to the rebellion that was brewing beneath his feet. He reveled in his self-proclaimed lordship, surrounded by sycophants and oblivious to the contempt that simmered in the hearts of the northern people. The confrontation was inevitable. It happened in the Great Hall, the heart of Winterfell, where the Stark banners had once proudly flown. Jon, leading a small band of loyalists, burst into the hall, his face grim, his sword dripping with Ironborn blood. Theon, startled and disoriented, could only stammer in disbelief. You're supposed to be dead." Jon's voice was cold, devoid of emotion. "Winter is never truly defeated, Theon, it only sleeps." The ensuing battle was short and brutal. The Ironborn, caught off guard and outnumbered by the hidden rebels, fell quickly. Theon, stripped of his bravado and reduced to a whimpering coward, was easily captured. With Theon secured, Jon stood before the assembled people of Winterfell, his face illuminated by the flickering torchlight. He saw fear, uncertainty, but also a flicker of hope. "The Ironborn came here promising strength," Jon declared, his voice ringing through the hall. "But all they brought was chaos and despair. They desecrated our home, they betrayed our trust, and they murdered our people. But their reign of terror is over." A cheer erupted, small at first, but growing in intensity as the people realized that Winterfell was free. The Stark banners were raised once more, their gray direwolves a defiant symbol against the encroaching darkness. But the victory was bittersweet. Winterfell was broken, its people traumatized, its trust shattered. Jon knew that reclaiming the castle was only the beginning. The real challenge was rebuilding. The immediate priority was to restore order. He organized patrols, established curfews, and ensured that the basic needs of the people were met. He held councils with the remaining leaders, listening to their concerns, addressing their fears, and working to heal the wounds of betrayal. Many among the common folk had suffered unspeakable losses, either at the hands of the Ironborn or by having to abandon their homes in favor of fleeing to the swamps or other distant hideouts. It was essential that these peoples were cared for. Jon tasked what remained of the Winterfell household with reaching out and providing everything the people needed. The greatest challenge, however, was rebuilding trust. Theon's betrayal had sown seeds of doubt and suspicion, poisoning the bonds that had once held the North together. Jon knew that he had to prove himself worthy of their trust, not through words, but through actions. He walked among the people, listening to their stories, sharing their grief, and offering what comfort he could. He worked alongside them, rebuilding homes, repairing walls, and planting crops. He showed them that he was not just a lord, but a protector, a leader who was willing to share their burdens and fight for their survival. Slowly, painstakingly, trust began to return. Not everyone was convinced, of course. Some still harbored doubts, suspicious of his motives, resentful of his claim to Winterfell. But as they witnessed his dedication, his compassion, and his unwavering commitment to the North, their hearts began to thaw. The damage caused by the Greyjoys ran deep. Homes were destroyed, families were torn apart, and the North was weakened at a time when it needed to be strong. But in the face of adversity, the spirit of the North shone through. The people of Winterfell, battered but not broken, stood together, determined to rebuild their home and reclaim their future. And at the forefront of this effort was Jon Stark, the bastard son who had proven himself to be a true leader, a protector of the North, and a worthy heir to the Stark legacy. The next challenge, however, would be facing Robb. What would be his reaction to Jon's recapture of Winterfell? Robb's return was less a triumphant homecoming and more the eye of a storm rolling in. The northern banners, emboldened by victories in the Riverlands, rippled across the horizon, a stark contrast to the snow-dusted landscape. He brought with him the momentum of conquest, the loyalty of hardened soldiers, and a burgeoning reputation as the young wolf. But what awaited him at Winterfell was a far more complex battlefield than any he'd faced south of the Neck. The first sign that something was amiss wasn't the lack of celebration, though that was noticeable. It was the faces. The common folk cheered as they always did, but their smiles were strained, their eyes darting nervously towards the imposing figure who awaited Robb at the gate. Not Catelyn, though she was there, a statue carved from ice and resentment. No, it was Jon. Jon, standing tall and resolute, clad in stark gray, but bearing a weight on his shoulders that Robb, in his eagerness for battle, hadn't fully grasped. The air crackled with unspoken tension, thick enough to choke on. The cheers felt hollow, the relief muted, overshadowed by the stark reality of the situation. Robb dismounted, the clatter of his armor echoing in the suddenly hushed courtyard. He strode towards Jon, 1,000 questions swirling in his mind, a knot tightening in his gut. News from Winterfell had been fragmented, filtered through the lens of war. He knew of Theon's betrayal of Winterfell's fall, but the details were shrouded, obscured by the urgent demands of his campaign. He knew Jon had somehow retaken it, but how? At what cost? And what had it done to him? "Jon," Robb began, his voice rough from travel and command. He reached out, intending to clap his brother on the shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie. But the words died in his throat, and his hand faltered. There was a barrier between them, invisible yet impenetrable, forged in the crucible of betrayal and responsibility. "Robb," Jon replied, his voice steady, but his eyes held a depth of experience, a weariness that Robb, despite his victories, couldn't claim to possess. "You've returned." It wasn't a greeting, not a brotherly welcome. It was a statement of fact, a recognition of a shift in power. Robb's gaze swept across the courtyard, taking in the grim faces of the guards, the apprehensive glances of the servants, the barely concealed animosity radiating from Catelyn. He understood then, with a chilling certainty, that he wasn't just returning to Winterfell. He was returning to a battlefield. The atmosphere inside the castle was even more charged. The Great Hall, usually a place of warmth and boisterous celebration, felt cold and sterile. The Stark banners, though hanging proudly, seemed to flutter with uncertainty. The Northern lords, grizzled veterans of countless battles, greeted Robb with respect, but their eyes kept drifting towards Jon, assessing, comparing. That night a feast was held, but it was a pale imitation of the gatherings Robb remembered. The laughter was forced, the conversation stilted, the air thick with unspoken anxieties. Robb sat at the head of the table, the rightful lord of Winterfell, the victorious general, but he felt like an outsider, a stranger in his own home. Catelyn, ever the pragmatist, tried to steer the conversation towards war strategy, towards securing alliances and bolstering defenses. But the lords were restless, their minds elsewhere. They spoke of the Ironborn, of the damage they had inflicted, but their words always circled back to Jon, to his leadership, to his actions during the siege. Finally, Lord Umber, never one to mince words, cleared his throat and addressed Robb directly. "Your Grace," he began, using Robb's newly acquired title, "while we celebrate your victories in the south, we cannot forget the events that transpired here in your absence. Lord Jon," he paused, glancing at Jon, who remained impassive, "showed great courage and resourcefulness in retaking Winterfell. He defended the north when we needed him most." The silence that followed was deafening. Robb could feel Catelyn's glare burning into the side of his face. He knew what Umber was implying. Jon had proven himself worthy of leadership, had earned the respect of the North. And now, Robb's return threatened to disrupt the fragile balance, to create a rift where unity was paramount. "Lord Umber speaks truly," Robb said, forcing a smile. "My brother has shown exceptional courage. He has my gratitude and the gratitude of the North." But the words rang hollow, even to his own ears. He knew that gratitude wouldn't be enough. He needed to address the issue head-on, to assert his authority, to reclaim his birthright. Later that night, after the feast had dissolved into uneasy murmurs, Robb sought out Jon in the godswood. The ancient trees stood silent witness to their meeting, their gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. "They look to you, Jon," Robb said, his voice low. "They respect you, they see you as their leader." Jon turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "I only did what was necessary." "But it's more than that, isn't it?" Robb persisted. "You saved Winterfell, you proved yourself, and now they question my right to rule." Jon remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the heart tree. "I never sought power, Robb, you know that. Winterfell is yours by right and by blood." "But will they accept it?" Robb asked, his voice laced with doubt. "Can I truly lead them, knowing that they see you as the hero, the savior?" "You are the young wolf," Jon said, his voice firm. "You have won battles, forged alliances. You have proven yourself worthy of command. Don't let doubt consume you. Lead them with strength and honor, and they will follow." Robb nodded, but his heart remained heavy. He knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to prove himself, to earn the loyalty of the North, not just by virtue of his birthright, but by his actions, his decisions, his leadership. And he knew, with a growing sense of unease, that the coming days would be fraught with challenges, with difficult choices, and with the ever-present threat of a power struggle that could tear the Stark family apart. The victory in the South felt hollow now, overshadowed by the battle brewing within the walls of Winterfell. The true war, he realized, had just begun. The Great Hall of Winterfell held its breath. Banners recently rehung rippled in the draft, a silent testament to the turmoil the castle had endured. Robb, newly returned from his victories in the South, stood tall, every inch the war leader. Jon, however, stood slightly apart near the hearth, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. The air crackled with unspoken tensions, with the weight of expectations, and with the simmering resentment that still lingered in some corners of the hall. "Jon has spoken," Robb declared, his voice resonating through the chamber. "He has chosen brotherhood over power." A murmur rippled through the assembled northern lords. Some looked relieved, others disappointed, still others plainly confused. They had witnessed a power struggle, a near fracturing of the Stark family, and now this. "It is true," Jon affirmed, stepping forward. "I relinquish my claim to Winterfell. The North needs a united Stark, not a divided one." He met Robb's gaze, a flicker of something akin to understanding passing between them. "My place is not on the throne, but beside my brother, defending our home." A wave of whispers broke out. Lord Manderly, ever the pragmatist, cleared his throat. "But Lord Snow, Lord Stark, what then will be your role? You have proven your strength, your leadership in the retaking of Winterfell. To simply step aside." Jon inclined his head. "I will remain a Stark of Winterfell, bound by blood and loyalty to the North. I will serve as Robb's warden of the marches. I will lead the defense against the wildlings in the North, ensuring the wall stands strong. I will train new recruits, hunting their skills so that the North will never again be caught unprepared." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the assembled lords, meeting their gazes one by one. "I will be the shield that guards Winterfell, so that Robb can be the sword that strikes down our enemies." Catelyn, who stood silently beside Robb, her face unreadable, shifted slightly. The tension in the room remained thick, but Jon's words had undeniably shifted the atmosphere. He wasn't seeking glory, wasn't clinging to power. He was offering his strength, his loyalty freely. "It is a noble offer," Robb said, breaking the silence. He turned to Jon, a genuine smile gracing his lips for the first time since his return. "And one I gladly accept. The North needs men like you, Jon, men who are willing to sacrifice personal ambition for the greater good." And so it was settled. Jon Snow, or rather Jon Stark, son of Ned Stark, would not be the Lord of Winterfell. He would become something different, something perhaps even more powerful. A Stark dedicated solely to the defense of the North, unburdened by the responsibilities of leadership, free to focus his considerable talents on protecting their home. In the days that followed, Winterfell underwent a subtle but significant transformation. Robb, now secure in his position as Lord, began the arduous task of rebuilding trust and repairing the damage inflicted by Theon's betrayal. He consulted with Jon on matters of defense, seeking his advice on troop deployments and fortifications. He listened to Jon's warnings about the growing threat beyond the wall, and while initially skeptical, began to take the wildling threat seriously. Jon, for his part, threw himself into his new role with unwavering dedication. He spent his days patrolling the northern borders, strengthening the defenses of the outposts and villages that lay exposed to the wildling threat. He trained new recruits, instilling in them not only fighting skills, but also a deep sense of loyalty to the North and its people. He became a familiar figure to the small folk, earning their respect and admiration with his quiet strength and unwavering commitment. He still faced prejudice, of course. Some of the northern lords remained suspicious of him, whispering behind his back about his bastard birth and his ambition. Catelyn, though outwardly civil, still regarded him with a wary eye, never fully trusting him. But Jon persevered, proving his worth through his actions, earning the respect of those who were willing to see past his name. The bond between Jon and Robb, tested and strained by the events of the past few months, began to heal. They still disagreed on occasion, but they learned to listen to each other, to respect each other's opinions, to work together for the good of the North. They were brothers, bound not by blood alone, but by loyalty, shared purpose, and a deep love for their home. Jon's decision to relinquish his claim to Winterfell had not only averted a potential conflict within the Stark family, it had forged a new path for him, a path that allowed him to embrace his Stark heritage without being confined by the expectations of lordship. He was a protector, a warrior, a shield against the darkness. He was Jon Stark, the Warden of the North, and he would stand ready to defend his home against any threat, from beyond the wall or from within the Seven Kingdoms. He would become the embodiment of Stark resilience, a testament to the strength of brotherhood and a symbol of hope for a North desperately in need of both. His legend was only just beginning.